Putin must know that. Putin must know that that is ultimately the ambition, that this friendship, this apparent friendship that's being offered by Trump doesn't really add up to much. It's more about the repositioning of America towards China. And therefore, perhaps he hasn't got all that much to fear from. He may calculate. He doesn't have that much to fear.
Roger Boyes, diplomatic editor of The Times, thank you for joining us on The World in 10. Sir Keir Starmer's plans in the aftermath of Friday appear contingent on American security guarantees. In fact, they are. So he says, are we not closer than ever, do you think, after Friday, to Donald Trump washing his hands entirely of Ukraine rather than actually agreeing to those?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there are different things that you have to take into account. One is how much bluff is involved in all of this. Yes, Zelensky does appear to have been ambushed, but in the White House meeting on Friday. But I think he was ambushed for a purpose, which is a performative purpose, really, to demonstrate to Russia that America is not an unflinching or uncritical ally of Ukraine, and that Russia can come to the negotiating table without worrying that they're going to be tripped up with some clever doublespeak. So that's the first thing, and there are, again, it's very difficult to see what red lines Trump is willing to set up in this situation, this rather complex situation. The first red line was a mining deal with Ukraine, and when Zelensky expressed public doubts about it, he was basically hustled out of the White House. But so one question is, how important is that to America? And is this mining deal, which is probably not all it's cracked out to be, is it just Trump's way of saying, this will be our stake in the future of Ukraine, so take our word for it, and that in a way, in a kind of roundabout way, an implicit security guarantee. If that was the intention, Zelensky didn't get it, and actually most people don't really get it. They think Trump is a transactional leader, and he's looking for the main chance, and that's what you have to deal with. But maybe there was something deeper behind it all.
Do you think then, I mean, the way you're talking suggests perhaps you do think that Zelensky and Trump's relationship is somehow repairable? I mean, what might need to be done beyond these sort of few statements that Zelensky has made since, thanking the American people for their support to get it back to a point where, I guess, frankly, Ukrainian people can have some hope for their future with American support? Well,
I mean, what we do know about Trump is that he thinks Ukraine is Europe's problem and should be Europe's problem and should remain Europe's problem. And therefore that Europe should dig into its pockets and pay for the defense of Ukraine, but also accelerate the path towards a peace deal and attract reconstruction funds, which is where a lot of the profits are to be made afterwards, if you look at it from a cynical Trump commercial point of view. So that's, those are the calculations, but where that leaves Zelensky is not clear. Another possible, I'm sorry about all these subtexts, but one has to sort of overanalyze these things because these things don't happen very often. The other possibility is that he actually wants to get rid of Zelensky, and this would be, and this is perhaps the most shocking thing of all for East European allies of America, and who, striven hard over decades to get into NATO and to have the security of NATO and the shield from Russian invasion or intervention. And so there's that shock effect that's still there and still lasting. And now it appears to be up to the West European allies, largely of United States within NATO, to find a way of rebuilding trust in the alliance itself. So a spat, which seemed to be fueled by vanity and why aren't you dressed properly, and why aren't you more thankful, and all these rather petty issues, has suddenly found its way into an existential corner, which is, what's NATO alliance for anyway? If it's not about United States protecting Europe from an aggressive Russia, well, what is it about? And these are really big questions, too big in a way for daily politics, and that's where we are. So there's this debate, and then there's a secondary question for the Trump team, which is Zelensky the right guy to lead Ukraine at a time when these questions are being asked? Of course, there's this narrative, Trumpian narrative, that Zelensky is essentially the child of the political child of Joe Biden, and that everything that was given to him over the past 3 years has been on Biden's blessing and is therefore suspect. And so all of this has to be disentangled, and it's very complex, and it's coming at a time when geopolitics in general is strained. This war has gone on for 3 years, and honestly, the Russians aren't making that much progress, but they're making more progress than the Ukrainians. There's a terrific demographic problem on both sides of the war. Young people are clearing out. There's a whole, when a war goes on for so long in a place that's densely populated, it drains the energy out of a whole chunk of geography, European geography in this case.
The sort of Western European allies of America that you mentioned there, element of that answer brings us on to this coalition of the willing, as Sir Keir Starmer put it. At the time of recording, only France has committed alongside the UK, although Starmer certainly made hints towards Italy and Canada doing so as well. How much of Europe do you think realistically needs to commit for this to sort of come to fruition and be valuable to Ukraine?
Well, it depends really what kind of peace agreement and you're going to have, and how intensely you're going to police it. So these are really abstract sums that we're talking about, because on the whole, Britain has an army of 70,000 men, and you need when you're talking about a deployment, you have to divide it by 3, because you need to replace those people after 6 months, and keep another another third of that force in reserve. So you're really stretched. It will really stretch the British Army, and and if America doesn't supply that's to say, it's not willing to join in this, then you're left with really what we might call undernourished armies. The German army, for example, it's got 50,000 men. So even though it's, much bigger and more advanced in some ways than Britain, it's got a much smaller army. That might change, but it will change over a period of 3, 4, 5 years. And that's not quick enough. So the idea, a coalition of the willing, something that dates back to 2003, Iraq, and all these kind of things, but it's always been flawed, because just because you're willing doesn't mean you're able, and this is the problem facing us on Ukraine too, that simply we don't have the men to put on the ground along a 1,500 kilometer border to make sure that the Russians don't do anything untoward. And more to the point, we have no way of protecting Ukraine and not losing our own men. So it's a domestic political decision of all these people who will or may not join in. The second thing is that there is a split amongst the people who are meeting in Lancaster House on Sunday, and therefore the putative coalition of the willing, between East and West. So you get a lot of East Europeans, a lot of small East European countries, the Baltic states, for example, who are very, very aware of Russian threats. I mean, they have borders, but not many men. And so, on the whole, a lot of these people didn't even turn up yesterday. So there's that issue. There's Poland, which has a big army and is spending almost 4.7% of its budget on defense, which is good, much better than anybody else, but it wants to, for electoral reasons partly, it wants to use that money to protect its own borders rather than to go on a peacekeeping adventure in neighboring Ukraine, which could easily spread, which could whet the appetite of the Russians for doing something on the Polish-Ukrainian border and just making trouble. So the Poles are actually, unusually for them, I must say, are keeping quite a low profile on this. So the solution, although it's not really a solution, but it's a kind of an answer to this, is a French proposal, which is to have a ceasefire that's essentially an airborne ceasefire and a seaborne ceasefire. So no boots on the ground, which everybody knows is a trigger point for electorates across Europe, and might stoke up, for example, far-right pro-Putin party groups, but does have an effect. It means you can watch troop movements from above. There are airborne radar systems, AWACS, which can do that. It's good to control the sea waters around Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine is not quietly strangled by the Russians, so this is Macron's idea, but Macron, first of all, isn't there for a long time. I mean, his tenure will evaporate after about 18 months or so, and second, there's no real thinking behind it. But it's the only idea that there is really at the moment. Nobody wants to put troops there, or says they're not able to put troops there, and So it's a plan without a plan. Now, I don't, that could be interpreted as a way of saying NATO's no good, but that's not quite the situation. The situation is that the whole crisis has been pushed too fast on the plate of the alliance. It moves very slowly, NATO, and for decades, America has been complaining that Europe doesn't spend enough and doesn't, help America enough, and now that's all come to a head, and it's just not soluble in the kind of time frame that is being given to Starmer. He's not done a bad job, it must be said, but the truth is, if it's going to work, he's got to have to get everyone on board very fast, and then when he's done that, present the idea to Trump, who then may just say, "Oh well, I'm not interested." In which case, NATO looks even weaker than it did before.
And it's actually that I wanted to come to. I mean, it was the very final line in your piece in the immediate aftermath of Friday that really got me thinking, where you talked about the sort of diplomatic rule book being ripped up on a daily basis. I wonder just how possible it is really to truly plan something short term, even, let alone the medium or long, when at any given moment Donald Trump can change his mind on it and, crush it. It's seemingly with almost one message on Truth Social, as it were.
Yes, that's all true. I mean, there's always been an inbuilt, or quite frequently been inbuilt tensions in a presidential administration on foreign policy things. I remember way back under Jimmy Carter, for example, there was Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, and they were at odds constantly about how to do it. And Brzezinski saw Russian threats everywhere. Vance didn't. And as a result, Carter tried to go down the middle and was left with a complete mishmash of policy. Now, so the Trump second administration is a little bit more focused than the first, and doesn't have that inbuilt confusion. But it's moving too fast. It accelerates at the wrong moments, and it is dependent on this trademark unpredictability of Trump. And in the old days, again in the Cold War, and we have to talk more and more about Cold War metaphors, because it's kind of it's kind of what we've got. In the old days, it was called the madman theory, which was basically someone like Richard Nixon, for example, saying, or letting it be known that he had nothing against bombing Russia or China or whatever, even though he had no intention to do so, but simply to keep the situation on the edge. And to give him negotiating power in different situations. And it could be that Trump is taking an old rule book, if you like, and trying to borrow lessons from this. But he's the least intellectual of American presidents that we've had for a long time, I suppose, since George Bush, I suppose. But even George Bush was brighter and more open to advice than Trump. So, and he's surrounded by these people who believe that they have, that believe that they're intimately in touch with what the American electorate want, and they want America to be a power that everybody listens to again. And this is the effect of it. This is the effect of it. The effect is that you say things for effect, for performative purposes and not necessarily with a goal in mind. And this is quite a dangerous moment.
I mean, that being said, we've sort of all assumed that Friday's scenes will have been met with jubilation in the Kremlin. I just wonder if there's any chance that sort of Vladimir Putin might actually also, alongside the initial jubilation, might be sort of rethinking his own tactics here. Because, if Trump can turn on Zelensky in, one fell swoop, he could possibly, if he doesn't get his way with regards to whatever he wants from Russia, couldn't he do the same to Putin?
Well, I think he probably does have one concrete aim with Putin, and that's to pull him away from China. So I think that the next step for Trump's foreign policy, once he's solved the Ukraine issue, is to turn his attention to China and to make it less of a challenger to American power, and that's his aim. Yeah, and if he can, and so Putin must know that. Putin must know that is ultimately the ambition. That this friendship, this apparent friendship that's being offered by Trump, doesn't really add up to much. It's more about the repositioning of America towards China. And therefore, perhaps he hasn't got all that much to fear from. He may calculate he doesn't have that much to fear. He may also calculate he can still carry on doing things with China, liaising with China, having military exercises with China, irrespective of what Trump wants from him. Putin almost certainly thinks he's smarter than Trump, and that therefore, in the end, he can outsmart him. But this is a moment that this should be Trump should have a wake-up call at some stage. It's no good if everybody thinks that takes him at face value and thinks that he's switched sides and is essentially that Trump is essentially Putin's main cheerleader.
One final one about Europe's relationship with America. We had all this narrative around Starmer's meeting on Thursday, didn't we? That it was spectacularly a success, perhaps more than anyone had imagined. Macron's the day or two before, less so, but there was still that sort of charm offensive. 2 days later, we had the aftermath of the Zelensky-Trump row, where in London, both those two leaders I mentioned stood in complete solidarity with Zelensky. I wonder how annoyed Trump might have been by that, and does it actually risk all the hard work that they'd put in Washington?
Well, he knew that Britain and France were Zelensky supporters, and he knew that about their skepticism towards Russia. So it was always up to Trump, really, to persuade them otherwise. And Trump hasn't made the effort. He's basically said, all he said really on Friday was, well, I trust Trump. Trump's never lied to me, which in itself is probably untrue. Yeah. But that's not an argument. It's not persuasive leadership. And this really is the big gap that's worrying everybody. That really there isn't a thought through American leadership and therefore not a proper transatlantic leadership of the West. So it's not just that people are saying, oh, God, NATO's on the brink. It's also that people are saying, well, what's the West now? We're living in somebody wrote the other day, we're living in the era of West-lessness. So, and I think that's where we are. And it could be that Trump changes. It could be that, but there's no evidence that he will change.